press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update.
Hello dear students. Today we shall discuss about nationalism in India. I am Dr. Denzy Lawrence. We will be taking in detail with you the rise of nationalism in the Indian context. Now, as you have seen, modern nationalism in Europe came to be associated with formation of various nation states. It also meant a change in people's understanding of who they were and what defined their identity and sense of belonging. There were new symbols and icons, new songs and ideas which forged new links and redefined the boundaries of communities. In most countries, the making of this new national identity was a long process. Now, how did all this consciousness actually emerge in the Indian context? So, as we've discussed in the first chapter, the rise of nationalism in Europe, we saw how countries like Germany and Italy led to a unified process and development of the idea of a state. Now, similarly, how did all this happen in the Indian context? Okay, how did we reach where we are today? Now, this idea in India can be described in this following context. Now, in India, as in Vietnam and many other colonies, the growth of modern nationalism is intimately connected to the anti-colonial movement. Now, the anti-colonial movement, as we all know, is the fight against the British. People began discovering the unity in the process of their struggle with colonialism. Now, the sense of being oppressed and subjugated under colonialism gave everybody a shared bond which tied people with the different groups to work together on the same lines. Now, each class and group felt the effects of colonialism differently. So, their experiences also was very varied and the notions of freedom was not always the same. The Congress under Mahatma Gandhi tried to forge these groups all together within one movement, but again, this unity did not emerge without conflict. In the earlier textbooks, you have read about the growth of nationalism in India up to the first decade of the 20th century. Now, in this chapter, we pick up the story from the 1920s and study the non-cooperation movement and the civil disobedience movements. Now, we'll explore how the Congress sought to develop the national movement and how different social groups participated in this movement and eventually how nationalism captured the imagination of people. So here, in a brief gist, you get a background understanding of the whole idea of India. Okay, so the nationalistic fervor or the nationalistic sentiment is a culmination as a result of various forms of struggle throughout the nationalist period spanning across many decades leading to the idea of India. Now this again, like I said, we'll be stressing more from the time which is the non-cooperation movement and the civil disobedience movement onwards. Now here you can notice that there is a mass procession which is being held on the streets, which became a very common feature during the national movement. I'm sure all of you would have seen movies regarding to patriotism and regarding to nationalist sentiment, so you would come across this classic symbol of how people marginalized and came together to protest against the colonial rise in the Indian context. Now, to understand this, we have to see what happened during India, or rather with India during the First World War, the importance of the Khilafat movement, and then the rise of the non-cooperation movement in the year 1920. Now, in the years after 1919, we see the national movement spreading to new areas, incorporating new social groups, and developing new modes of struggles. How do we understand these developments? What implications did they have? So in the years after 1919, we see that many people are coming together, okay? Various social groups like the women were marginalizing, the backward classes were coming together. Like this, many social groups came in with their each and own mode of struggle. Now, how did they understand these developments and what implications did they have? Now, first and foremost, the First World War. Now, as we know, it spanned between 1914 to 1919. This created a new political and economic situation. Now, because there was a war going on, it led to a huge increase in the defense expenditure, which was financed by the war loans and increasing taxes. Custom duties were raised and the income tax was introduced. Now, through the war years, we see the prices actually go up, doubling between 1913 and 1918, leading to extreme hardship for the common people. So, villages were being called upon to supply the soldiers, And this forced recruitment, that is forcibly making people enroll in the army, caused a lot of widespread anger. So in year 1918 and 19 and 1920 and 21, at the same point of time, repeated crops failed in many parts of India. Now this resulted in acute shortages of food, which was also accompanied by the influenza epidemic. According to the census of 1921, 12 to 13 million people perished as a result of famines and the epidemic. Now here, to bring to you to notice as to what exactly happened, were the two main important events which led to the fall in the economic and the political situation. Now, as we all know, the First World War actually caused a huge toll on the people because there was something called forced recruitment. And in this forced recruitment, we notice that basically we are seeing the kind of villagers being recruited in the army camps. Now, this forced recruitment is going to cause a lot of people to protest around and not fight for the British from the part of the Indian army. At the same point of time, there was a very famous epidemic, or rather pandemic, very similar to what we are facing in the world right now, like the COVID pandemic. About 100 years ago, we had something called the Spanish flu epidemic. So once you have widespread disease and then you have widespread anger and unrest, you see that these were the perfect conditions for the country to develop into a nationalist sentiment and eventually fight for freedom. So people hoped their hardships would end eventually after the war was over, but that did not happen. Next, coming to the idea of Satyagraha. Now, Mahatma Gandhi returned to India in the year January 1915. Now, as you know, he had come from South Africa where he had successfully fought. Now, this is an illustration where you can see the Indian workers in South African marching through Walcrest on the 6th of November 1913. And you can notice that Mahatma Gandhi was leading the workers from Newcastle to Transvaal. When the marchers were stopped and Gandhiji was arrested, thousands or more people joined in the Satyagraha, eventually coming to the idea that you need to give rights to the non-whites. So we see in this particular context, the idea of Satyagraha came into existence. Now, this was basically a protest against the racist regime with the simple method of mass agitation. Now, what is mass agitation? Okay, mass is something is an enormously huge amount, and agitation is to protest. So, this mass agitation, which he called Satyagraha, was the idea emphasizing the power of the truth and the need for searching for the truth. Now, it is suggested that if the cause was true and the struggle was against injustice, then the physical force was not necessary to fight your oppressor. Without seeking vengeance or being aggressive, a Satyagrahi could win the battle through non-violence. Now, this could be done by appealing to the conscience of the oppressor. People, including the oppressors, had to be persuaded to see the truth instead of being forced to accept the truth through the use of violence. By this time, the truth was bound to ultimately triumph, and Mahatma Gandhi believed that this dharma of non-violence could unite all the Indians. So here is a concept of Satyagraha, which is basically, in Mahatma Gandhi's own words, is of passive resistance. Now, this is a weapon of the weak, but the power which can be the subject of this article can be used only by the strong. The power is not passive resistance. Indeed, it calls for intense activity. And the movement in South Africa was not passive, but it was very active. Satyagraha is not a physical force, whereas a Satyagrahi does not inflict pain on the adversary. Remember, in Satyagraha mode of struggle, we do not seek the destruction. It is, in fact, there is no concept of ill will whatsoever, because Satyagraha is a pure soul force. Because at the center of it is truth, which is the actual substance of the soul, and this is the reason why the force is called Satyagraha. The soul is informed with knowledge, and in it burns the flame of love. Non-violence is the supreme dharma. Now, it is certain that India cannot rival Britain or Europe in the force of arms. The British worship the war god, and they can become all of these as they're becoming bearers, and the hundreds of millions in India can actually go to the idea of non-violence. So after arriving in India, Mahatma Gandhi successfully organized the Satyagraha movements in various places. In the year 1916, he traveled to the Champaran area in Bihar to inspire the peasants and the farmers there to struggle against the oppressive plantation system. In the year 1917, he organized a Satyagraha to support the peasants of the Kheda district in Gujarat. Now, affected by crop failure and also reeling under a plague epidemic, the peasants of Kheda could not pay the revenue and were demanding that revenue collection be relaxed. In the year 1918, Mahatma Gandhi went to Ahmedabad to organize a Satyagraha movement amongst all the cotton mill workers. So, dear students, this is how the idea of Satyagraha actually arose. Now, the concept of passive resistance, where there is no kind of destruction wished for the oppressor, but it is only through the triumph of the truth, which is the inner soul seeking, will eventually make them and strike out to their conscience. So, this idea of non-violent struggle, which eventually we read that it has given enormous and phenomenal results, was idea of Mahatma Gandhi to bring into foray the nationalistic spirit and fervor. Followed by this, we had certain important legislations which also raised the cause for nationalism. The Rowlatt Act. Now, emboldened with the success of this non-cooperation movement or this passive resistance through Satyagraha, Gandhiji in the year 1919 decided to launch a nationwide Satyagraha against the proposed Rowlatt Act of 1990. Now, this particular act had been hurriedly passed through the Imperial Legislative Council in spite of people giving a united opposition of the Indian members. Now, what exactly this act was? It gave the government enormous powers, that is, a lot of power to repress political activities and allowed people, that is, the political prisoners, to be detained in jail without trial for the period of 2 years. And Mahatma Gandhi wanted the non-violent civil disobedience against such unjust laws, which would start on the Hartal on the 6th of April 1990. So this is how the Rowlatt Act, which actually came into existence because the government wanted to have a lot of power to suppress the political activities, that is any kind of freedom struggle, and also made sure that they are able to detain the political prisoners without presenting them in a court or giving them a trial for the period of 2 years. So Mahatma Gandhi found this as a very, very apt opportunity to instigate and to start a non-violent civil disobedience. Now, civil disobedience is the entire population not following the orders of the government. So such kind of civil disobedience against such unjust law would begin by means of a Hartal on 6th of April 1990. Now, in accordance with this, rallies were organized in various cities, workers went on strike in railway workshops, and the shops closed down. Alarmed and awakened by the popular upsurge and scared that the lines of communication like the railways and the telegraph would be disrupted, the British administration decided to clamp down, that is to control on the nationalists. Local leaders were picked up from Amritsar and Mahatma Gandhi was barred from entering Delhi. On the 10th of April 1919, the police in Amritsar fired upon a peaceful procession, provoking widespread attacks on banks, post offices, and the railway stations. Martial law was imposed and General Dyer took command. So this is how we notice that how protection or of the people's rights and their ability to protest was clamped down by the British government. So the colonial powers actually instigated the people more because they were actually protesting in a non-violent manner. And when a non-violent crowd, that is without the use of any violence or without any use of disruption, if they've been attacked, by the brute administrative forces, automatically we understand that the people's instigated motions were provoked. And that is eventually how this kind of Rowlatt Act actually led to the mass unrest. Now, on 13th of April is where this infamous Jaalin Bagh incident happened. As we mentioned previously here, General Dyer ordered the shooting on innocent unarmed people when they had gathered for a prayer meeting in the enclosed ground of Jaalin Bagh. Now, this was in Amritsar. Now, being from outside the city, people were unaware that the martial law had been imposed. So Dyer, the moment he entered the area, he blocked the exit points and started open fire on the crowd, killing hundreds of people. His object was later, as he declared, to produce a moral effect, to create in the minds of Satyagrahis a feeling of terror and awe. So this is how General Dyer, with his mentality, wanted to instill fear in the minds of people and to make sure that they would never rise again. But what happened was exactly the opposite. As the news of Jallianwala Bagh spread, the people and the crowds took to the streets in many North Indian towns. There were strikes, there were clashes with the police, and attacks on government buildings. And the government responded again with brutal repression, trying to humiliate and terrorize people across the areas. The Satyagrahis who were protesting were forced to rub their noses on the ground and crawl on the streets and do salam, which is salute, to all the sahibs. People were flogged, and in villages around the Gujranwala in Punjab, which is now in Pakistan, was actually bombed. Seeing all this violence spread, Mahatma Gandhi called off the movement. Now, while the Rowlatt Satyagraha had been a widespread movement, it was still limited to mostly the cities and the towns. Mahatma Gandhi understood that there is a need to launch a more broad-based movement which could actually engulf majority parts of the country. But he was certain that no such movement could be organized without bringing the Hindus and the Muslims together. One way of how he can doing this was to take up the Khilafat issue. Now here we discuss what exactly is the Khilafat issue. Now the First World War, remember, it ended in the year 1919. It resulted with the defeat of the Ottoman Turkey. And there were rumors that there was going to be a very harsh peace treaty going to be imposed on the Ottoman Emperor, who was the spiritual head of the Islamic world, the Khalifa. To defend the Khalifa's temporal powers, a Khilafat committee was formed in Bombay in the year March 1919, and a young generation of Muslim leaders like the brothers Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali began discussing with Mahatma Gandhi about the possibility of a united mass action on this issue. Now this was seen as an opportunity to bring Hindu-Muslim unity, where the Muslims were being brought under the umbrella of a unified national movement. So at the Calcutta session of the Congress in the year 1920, he convinced other leaders of the Congress to start a non-cooperation movement in support of the Khilafat as well as for the Swaraj. So here, the idea for national unity was actually being utilized by Mahatma Gandhi by supporting the Khilafat movement in a means of actually attaining Swaraj or independence. So this is how the Khilafat movement, which is a post-World War event, an incident, was able to bring to highlight all the detailed reasons for the united front. So here we see what was the need for non-cooperation. Now, in a famous book, Hind Swaraj, in the year 1909, Mahatma Gandhi declared that the British rule in India was established because the people there were supporting. That means, with the help of cooperation of Indians, the Britishers were able to rule, and they had survived also because there was continuous cooperation. What if the Indians refused to cooperate? The British rule in India will collapse within a year and Swaraj would come. How could non-cooperation become a movement? Gandhiji proposed that this movement should be done in stages. First and foremost, it should begin with the surrender of titles that the government awarded, and you need to boycott all the civil services like the army, the police, the courts and the legislative councils, the schools and the foreign goods. Then, in case the government will use repression, a full civil disobedience campaign will be launched. So this was the idea how they were actually planning to do. So here when we understand, non-cooperation literally means not cooperating with the establishment. For example, you and me, we conform and we follow the government rules and regulations. Let's say from tomorrow, we fail to follow, or we go out in protest and say that we are not going to follow the rules, we are not going to boycott the services, we are not going to join the nation building process. That would be disobedience, but it would be of a civil nature. That is in the entire sense that it is a general thing which is happening. At that point of time, because Gandhiji wanted to actually attack on the knees of the British Empire, that was the reason why the boycott was called for services, the army, police, because it is with the help of these services the British were able to control the majority part of our Indian area. So, in continuance with this, they came together and they started to follow a certain stage where they would do it in 1 and 2 stages eventually. Now, throughout the summer of 1920, Mahatma Gandhi and Shaukat Ali toured extensively mobilizing support for this movement. But many within the Congress were concerned about these proposals. They were reluctant to boycott the council elections, which were scheduled for the year November 1920. And they feared that this might lead to popular violence. Like as I said previously, in the idea of post First World War, there was a lot of popular violence because followed by the Jaalin Bagh massacre, there was a huge amount of violence which erupted across in the states of North India. So similarly, people here also feared that this might lead to popular violence. In the months between September and December, there was an intense tussle within the Congress. For a while, they seemed like there is no meeting point between the supporters and the opponents of the movement. So finally, at the Congress session at Nagpur in December 1920, a compromise was worked out and non-cooperation program was fully adopted. So this is how we see that how the idea of non-cooperation, which was a thought process where it actually attacked the core of the British Empire. So in the further classes, we'll see how did the movement unfold, who were the people who participated in it, and how the different social groups actually conceived the idea of non-cooperation. So non-cooperation happens to be one of the most significant ideas we notice in the development of independence in the Indian context. Thank you very much.